Now, also in Australia, we've been seeing this long-standing debate over immigration that's been reignited recently after anti-immigration protests swept across major cities, some hijacked by neo-Nazi voices, and those protests were met with counter-demonstrations, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called for calm, but the rallies have exposed deep divisions in a nation built on multicultural roots. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Paul Allen and our next guest, Anna Boucher. She is an associate professor in public policy and comparative politics at the University of Sydney. Paul, let's maybe start with you first. What are we seeing recently in terms of these anti-immigration protests down under?
Well, Avril, nothing particularly new. We have seen it before in recent history. About 10 years ago, we've seen immigration protests, and about 20 years ago as well, there were the well-known Cronulla riots, which all focused on exactly this type of thing. So it's not totally unfamiliar, but it's always disturbing when it does happen. Now, as you mentioned there, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been downplaying this, but one concerning aspect of this is, well, the quite brazen appearance almost of neo-Nazi groups as well, and that's really adding an extra degree of concern to what we've been seeing with some of these protests. Let's get to Anna Boucher now for some of her insight here. I just want to start, Anna, if I can. If you can give us an overview of what the statistics are saying. What are the actual arrival numbers saying about immigration into Australia? Is it increasing, and what sorts of countries are migrants coming from?
Immigration has actually gone down in the last financial year. The net overseas migration is at about 340,000. Some of these groups have cited arrival statistics, but government, for instance, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is saying you shouldn't rely on those because they don't factor in the exit numbers. So anyone who spends any time at Sydney or Melbourne Airport will know we have a lot of people coming in and a lot of people going out. What we need to look at is the net overseas migration. 340, it is down from the prior year, and that's largely as a result of government policy, particularly in the area of international student migration.
So if you say numbers are actually declining, what is spurring these protests? I mean, we've seen them occur more than once over recent weeks. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, is downplaying the numbers. So is it a small group, nothing to worry about, or is it a sign that something deeper and more troubling might be brewing?
It's not that small. It's 15,000 people across Australia and protests in all major cities. Look, I think people are concerned about the cost of living. People are concerned about infrastructure, whether it's sufficient, and migration becomes an easy thing to blame for those pressures. Actually, those issues are very complex and multifaceted in their sources, but often people are looking for easy solutions and easy scapegoats, and immigration provides one to a lot of those protesters, and I think that's what's explaining it. Also, generally, we've had an increase in social movements and protest behaviour in Australia over the last few years, and so potentially these groups are thinking this is also a way that they can engage in policy change. Whether that will occur or not is to be seen.
What do you think should be the institutional response and potential tightening up in response to what we're seeing there?
By tightening up, you mean of the migration program?
Institutional responses to some of these anti-immigration protests that we're seeing. How do you think the administration can perhaps mitigate that development?
Well, people have a right to protest, and I mean, it was the same with the pro-Palestinian protests. There is a right to protest in Australia. Obviously, the law needs to be applied if the protests become violent, if hate speech is occurring at the protests, then there needs to be natural limits upon those protests. But people have a right to have their views, irrespective of whether we disagree with them or not. I also think the Prime Minister made the point that it's important not to allow protesters to be further ostracised or pushed into a further radical behaviour. So were you to quash these protests entirely and not allow people to have their views, there is a risk of further radicalisation, and we don't want that. So it's obviously a delicate balancing act for government. They need to ensure that there aren't riots, that there isn't hate speech occurring, which can be difficult to police. But at the same time, if they were to close it down entirely, there would be, I think, other risks that could arise.
Yeah. Professor, how much clarity is the government actually providing on its migration program, you think?
I think the government's quite clear. The problem is it's not that easy to explain. I mean, migration statistics are complex, but anyone who follows the news closely will see that the government has said on multiple occasions that net overseas migration is down, that they have tried to put caps in place for student migration. So I think that they are attempting to do that. The problem is that there is complexity with regards to the data, and that could be part of the communication issue. Also, we know this from social research, people will believe what they want to believe. So if there is an underlying bias or belief system, that can be quite hard to challenge even with empirical data. The third thing I would say is that we need to hear more positive stories about migration and multiculturalism. And that is something where I think we can have more work can be done on intercultural dialogue, on the benefits of migration. That communication story could come out even stronger, and that may assist someone.
This issue is also tied into another issue that concerns many in Australia, and that is housing prices and the housing shortage as well. And recent RBA analysis, Reserve Bank of Australia analysis, has shown that the housing market is under pressure from the numbers of international students in the country. Now, on the one hand, education is such an important source of revenue for Australia. It's the fourth largest export. But on the other, it does create these pressures on the housing market. So how do you get this balance right, and is it right at the moment?
Well, there's different studies that have been done, and I personally haven't read a conclusive study that says that the housing market is the issues in the housing market are primarily being driven by migration. There's other studies that, for instance, suggest there's no correlation. But one thing that can be done, which was also mandated, I think 2 years ago by the government, is to require universities to increase their rate of university housing supply. So there is housing for international students. That's one option. Diversification of where international students are located, which has been part of the reforms that the government attempted in the prior administration. Is another option. So, for instance, more accommodation in regional areas is another way that can be dealt with. And obviously increasing the rate of construction and production of new housing, including densification in cities, which would mean more people living in apartments, but would obviously increase the housing stock as well. So I think there's a few different options that are available.
Well, also more broadly, like a lot of developed nations, Australia's got a birth rate that's below replacement. It's got a skills shortage as well. It's got an ageing population also. So are current migration settings enough to address all of those problems, particularly the skills shortage?
No, of course not. I mean, no country in the world is going to deal with ageing population just through migration, because especially if the migration is permanent, migrants also age. So that's the first point. The second point is with skills shortage, yes, skilled migration and even semi-skilled migration is an important component of addressing skills shortages. And with the new data we have coming through Jobs and Skills Australia, it's clear that migration will be part of that puzzle. But we also need to ensure that we upskill Australian workers, that there is more support for those going into the skilled trades, for instance, and that is an area where the government has done work, but obviously it will be slow. It takes time to train up people, and we really need the workers as soon as possible. So migration, I always say, is part of the puzzle, but it is not the only solution to these complex social problems.